Terence Dooley probably wasn't being introduced to a Monaghan audience, but we welcome you today, Terence. Thank you for continuing with this engagement even after your recent accident. We look forward to your reflections on Monaghan's shared heritage.
Thanks very much. Minister Humphreys, Reverend Nesbitt, public representatives, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and some very old friends in the audience as well. First of all, I feel as if I have to apologise for sitting. I hate sitting when I'm doing something like this, but I'm afraid I have to. Also for turning up so casually dressed, in fact in 1.5 leg trousers. So please excuse me for all of that. But I want to begin, like everybody else who's come before me, by congratulating the Reverend Nesbitt and the local community on this magnificent achievement of the restoration of Cahans Meeting House. It's a lasting monument, and not just to the built heritage of the Presbyterian community in this area, but to the shared heritage of County Monaghan. And at this stage, I think it also appropriately to publicly recognise and acknowledge the monumental work which Reverend Nesbitt has done in preserving the history, the culture, the traditions and so on of Presbyterianism in Monaghan in his wonderful books, Full Circle and The Drumkeen Story. And these will be invaluable sources to future generations. And very importantly, from my own perspective, I just want to thank David for the privilege and the honour of the invitation to speak here on this very, very special occasion. Now, he and I toed and froed for quite a while about what I would speak about, and as I hope you'll understand, the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry, and I certainly didn't see a torn Achilles tendon getting in the way of preparing for a talk such as this. But David has been immensely patient and generous, and in the end we decided on reflections on the shared heritage of County Monaghan. Now, reflections can be fairly grandiose, and it's not intended to be that whatsoever, but I will bring you through lots of my own experience as well as everything else. But let me begin with a quotation from one of our great late novelists and playwrights, Eugene McCabe, who gave the following topographical description of Monaghan in the introduction to Paddy Duffy and Eamon O'Keefe's wonderful Monaghan History and Society that was published about 5 years ago. And I quote, "Winnicott, county of the little hills, bundle upon bundle of odd-shaped fields, mounds, forts and keeps, topped by circles of ash and thorn, glacier-carved bumps and hollows, creating hundreds of natural amphitheatres and hidden townlands, the whole furnished with lakes and rivers, boglands and bottomlands, hedges of magical blackthorn, sheltering winds, bracken, bluebells, wild garlic and cow parsley, deep dug ditches and some wonderful stands of planter hardwood, all of it accessible by more roads, lanes, tracks, byroads, canal walks, farm passes and obsolete railway lines and sidings than any other area in Western Europe." Now, for me, that vividly captured the unique Monaghan landscape that framed my childhood imagination. I was born and reared on the same road as Patrick Kavanagh, and I remember him when I was a child as he walked over the road between Essexford and Mucker. But I'm afraid the historian in me tells me that it was only my imagination, and what images I have of him were probably those that were the creations of local lore and passed on to the next generation. But, and I think this very much applies to all Monaghan people, he and I shared that same affinity for the drumlined Monaghan landscape. And at primary school in Ballymackney in the early 1970s, we were taught from a very early age to appreciate and cherish the landscape. We were taught toponymy, the study of place names. Now, I wonder how many primary children are taught that today. But it meant that we knew the name of every townland in the parish of Killarney, and how their names had derived from the Gaelic language. And in this way, we came to understand the topography around us. So I woke up every morning and I looked across at one of the ancient forts of the McMahon family on the hills of Dunelty or Dún Elicha. And I lived in the townland of Garley-Goban, the marshy garden of the stepping stones. And Rotherham Skeen, the knife-edged hill, was to the east, as was Dromurvey, the ridge of the level stretch of sandy land. And then there was the nebulous or ill-defined townland of Essexford, which the postal address told me was where I lived, ignoring completely Garley-Goban. And Essexford was further emphasised by these tall concrete letters that spelled out ESSEXFORD behind our house, denoting a disused railway line that had once brought great excitement to a rural townland. And Essexford is unique. It's one of the very, very rare townlands in Ireland which doesn't have a Gaelic root, an invention, in other words, of a later time. And again, when I was a boy, I remember my father digging up an Elizabethan coin in our back garden. And after he had scraped centuries of clay from it, he drolly expressed his satisfaction that this was proof that we were standing where Hugh O'Neill, the first Earl of Tyrone, had halted Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex's march on Gaelic Ulster during the 9 Years' War of 1595 to 1603. And it was believed that the Dooleys came up from the Midlands, with Turlough O'Byrne to fight in that campaign and subsequently settled in the area. Now, Byrne is still the most common name in Killarney, and there's a very large pocket of Dooleys in South Monaghan, while Terns is, of course, the English version of Turlough, who led the O'Byrnes to Farney. So there must be something, I reckon, in it. But my father's generation, as generations before him, believed that on the 7th of September 1599, O'Neill and Essex had parleyed at the nearby ford, which then gave it its name. And the subsequent treaty offered much needed respite to O'Neill, but ultimately it contributed to Essex's fall from grace and the loss of his head on an Elizabethan chopping block. But clearly, Essexford had resonated in the local popular imagination as a site of victory, ushering in a Gaelic myth, where the great O'Neill had seen off his English enemy. But then, why wasn't it called O'Neill's Ford? Locals never thought of the name as signifying something equally historical, the beginning of the English colonisation of South Monaghan. And from then on, two cultures would clash, sometimes violently and sometimes, unfortunately, tinged with sectarian hatred, as in 1641. But too often, we also forget that they lived together in peace. Now, there were very few Presbyterians in South Monaghan. We did have one neighbour, Preston Hughes, who I often went to for the cure of ankle sprain, long before there were physiotherapists. In fact, I might have went to him 2 weeks ago if he had been still alive. As school kids, we didn't understand what the differences were because we were never taught, as students rightfully are today, to understand and respect religious differences. And then, when the Troubles broke out in Northern Ireland, we watched on tiny black and white screens atrocities being reported every night in the news. Catholic paramilitaries, Protestant paramilitaries, sectarian murder and crime. The sectarian hatred, we were told, went back to the plantation of Ulster, to the confiscation of Catholic lands. Catholic and civil liberties were denied under the discriminatory penal laws. So on both sides, the true complexities of Irish history were therefore lost. In 1780, for example, the Protestant grand jurors of Monaghan, including the great gentry families of Leslie of Glaslough, Lucas of Castleshane, Anketel of Anketel Grove, Corrie of Racorrie, Kerr of Newbliss, Richardson of Poplar Vale, and so on, they gathered, and I quote, affirmed that no parliament has, or of right, ought to have any power or authority whatsoever in this kingdom except the Parliament of Ireland. So this was 20 years before the Act of Union. We were told that Wolfe Tone, founding father of Irish republicanism, though of a nature that he would hardly understand today, was an Anglican, or that Presbyterians also suffered civil and religious persecution under the penal laws, that they resented the payment of tithes to the established church just as much as their Catholic neighbours, that in Monaghan, small Presbyterian farmers suffered as much during the famine as their Catholic counterparts, or that Catholic and Presbyterian farmers stood together, shoulder to shoulder, in Monaghan against landlords during the tenant right campaign of the 1850s. These farmers had all the same grievances, and they wanted the same rights: fair rents, free sale, and fixity of tenure. But of course, the Reverend Nesbitt has revealed all of this and more, including the history of Presbyterians and the linen industry, education and philanthropic concern for the poor, spiritual life and faith, in his aforementioned books. It was the coming together of the nationalist Home Rule movement and the Land League in the early 1880s that sundered any loose alliance based on agricultural grievances. And in the interests of the Union of Great Britain and Ireland, Presbyterian farmers threw in their lot with their landlords. They backboned the Orange Order, provided support to the Ulster Volunteer Force, joined the British Army during the Great War. And during the War of Independence, a few suffered the worst type of atrocities. Many more left Monaghan following partition to live with their co-religionists in the north of the border. And that wasn't the first time they had left. Economic necessity had also driven whole Presbyterian congregations away at different times over the centuries. Of course, and it's been mentioned many times here already today, one of the most famous being the 1764 Cahan Exodus, the 260th anniversary of which occurs next year, and should provide wonderful opportunity to local heritage officers and maybe Monaghan curators, museum curators, and the local community to celebrate, especially with their American cousins. So I would say to you, invite them home for a gathering. In the 1980s, I embarked on an academic journey of discovery when I began my postgraduate studies in Maynooth. And for my MA thesis, I intended to write on what is now generally referred to as the revolutionary period in Monaghan from 1912 to 1923, which of course Minister Humphreys is only too familiar with, given her outstanding contribution to the decade of centenaries, and I'll return to this later. But among the first of the major primary sources I consulted was the Northern Standard. Now, I was very familiar with the Northern Standard. I ran over to Kelly's shop at Essexford every Thursday evening to buy it, to read the GAA reports from the previous week's football matches. What I didn't know at the time was that the Standard had been founded way back in 1839, the first weekly edition proclaiming Monaghan as the frontier county of the Protestant North, and setting out in no uncertain terms that, and I quote, "The principles of this journal shall be strictly conservative of the British connection in the capital of Irish conservatism, the Protestant North." And by 1912, those who defined themselves as Protestants made up approximately 26% of Monaghan's population, including 8,500 Presbyterians, or 12% of the county's total. And Monaghan had always been a frontier county, the borderlands between the Anglo-Norman Pale of the 12th century and the last great bastion of Gaelic Ireland. And of course, the borderlands are endlessly fascinating in respect of research potential. Again, I'll come back to this. It's probably fair to say that my engagement with the Northern Standard was career-changing. For months, I became immersed in every single edition, from the beginning of the land war in the 1880s to the Boundary Commission of 1926. I was introduced to a whole new world and quickly became immersed in the history of Protestant politics and society. The focus and the title of my thesis changed completely, and I ended up writing The Decline of Unionist Politics in Monaghan, 1912 to 26, much of which was then later published in the Cahans record. The bias of the Northern Standard had to be balanced, and in order to do this, I used the Dundalk Democrat, a Home Rule or nationalist newspaper widely circulated in the county. What both newspapers reflected was the polarisation of Monaghan society and politics at the time along politico-religious lines, and neither editor could be given any praise for doing anything to ease sectarian tensions in that period. Yes, there was much sectarian rhetoric, and it was rooted in the memory of land confiscations, penal laws, memories of famine, and then perpetuated from the 1880s by Home Rule versus Unionism, the Ulster Volunteer Force and the Irish National Volunteers, followed then by the bitterness often engendered by events during the War of Independence and the Civil War. The beginning of the Great War in 1914 had seen a temporary rapprochement as young men from all sides went to various fronts to fight new enemies. And all this time, we sometimes overlook the simple fact that people go on with living their everyday lives. But how did they do so during the tense summer days, for example, of 1914, as civil war threatened again in Ireland? And if there was civil war, it would be fought out along politico-religious lines. Did neighbours stop talking to each other? Did they stop helping each other during the hay season? Did Catholic shopkeepers look suspiciously on their Presbyterian customers, or vice versa? What was conversation like in the little public houses of Rockcorry or New Bliss? Or did they share each other's grief when news came from the front that their sons had been killed? Were resentments born that festered for generations? In other words, what did ordinary people do in extraordinary times? That might be a very good name or good title for an exhibition. Ordinary People in Extraordinary Times, Monaghan and Partition. Most of the talk this year has been about civil war, and in the years to come it's going to be about partition. Monaghan wasn't terribly affected by civil war, and that's not to pass it by. Of course it wasn't, but it was probably more gravely affected by partition. And much will be written about this in the future years, and much needs to be written about it, and there will be challenges. I know from decades of research how difficult it is, for example, for older generations of Protestant families in this area to talk about partition. But I know there are people still alive who closely guard hidden histories, oral and documentary, and these shouldn't be lost because of ancestral suspicions. We need to move beyond suspicion. Facing the future will be much less daunting if we stand up to the past. The potential for research into our borderlands, as I said, is endlessly fascinating. The border cut communities off from their spiritual ethnic communities. It created economic hardships on the one hand, and it bolstered the smuggling industry on the other. It led to the migration of Protestants from south to north, almost 2,000 in Monaghan's case between 1912 and 1925. It cut farmers off from their land. The border affected women differently to men. It gave a new generation of children a sense of place or where they came from. Where are you from? I'm from the border. Well, what exactly does that mean? William Van Schentel has put it as follows. No matter how clearly borders are drawn on official maps, how many customs officials are appointed, or how many watchtowers are built, people will ignore borders whenever it suits them. In doing so, they challenge the political status of which borders are the ultimate symbol. People also take advantage of borders in ways that are not intended or anticipated by their creators. Revolutionaries hide behind them, seeking the protection of another sovereignty. Local inhabitants cross them whenever services or products are cheaper or more attractive on the other side. And traders are quick to take advantage of price and tax differentials. I think that definition will resonate with us in Monaghan. And I think that means we can relate to people living along any border anywhere else in the world. Borders can be studied by historians, by geographers, political scientists, anthropologists, sociologists, and even linguists, because there is a language unique to borderlands. And now that the decade of centenaries is ending, the rest of the 2020s can provide rich research potential in Monaghan to be explored and exploited by our museum and heritage officers. Gathering the folklore of the border is just one project that immediately springs to mind, and how its establishment was seen differently by Catholics and Protestants living in its vicinity. There is still a generation alive who can tell that story. And one centenary that shouldn't be ignored this year is the passing of the 1923 Land Act on the 9th of August 1923. One of the most important pieces of social legislation passed by an independent Irish government, and arguably one that went a long way to ending the Civil War. And here is a great opportunity, not just this year, but also in the years ahead, to celebrate the shared heritage of small farm life in Monaghan, experienced by Catholics and Presbyterians alike. To examine, for example, the working of the Irish Land Commission at local level, the depths of land hunger, the struggle and strife of small farm life. And why not tie it all into the poetry and novels of Patrick Kavanagh? The Great Hunger, an epic and powerful evocation of rural life with all its rural frustrations. And Terry Flynn, where one of the central themes is land hunger, based on Kavanagh's own family experiences. Last year, I published a book on the burnings of the Big House in Ireland. And in the course of it, I explored the motivations and the reasons why big houses throughout the country might have been burned between 1920 and 1923. And of course, there are a myriad of reasons for this. But one of the reasons that we don't often appreciate is land hunger, or the connection between agrarian violence and political violence in any particular area. And why would that be the case? Because historians for a long time believed that with the passing of the 1903 Land Act and the revolutionary transfer of land ownership, then land questions were no longer important in Ireland. But the very important point they missed, was the continuation of congestion. And congestion means the clustering of small uneconomic farms in a particular community or locality. Traditionally, it was believed this was all in the west of Ireland. But Monaghan had a very high proportional rate of small farms in 1922 that fell under the definition given by the Irish Land Commission of being uneconomic or unviable. They were less than 23 acres in size, or £10 in valuation. So, in the future, going beyond 1923, what had to happen was that the government had to find land to bring these farms up to a more viable level. And in order to find them, that often meant targeting those who had what was perceived to be too much land. And under the 1923 Land Act, the government was given the compulsory power to acquire the main and untended lands of big houses or country houses. So the 1920s, the 30s and the 40s were far more detrimental to big houses or country houses than had been the burning or the arsonist of the 1920 to 1923. Take, for example, the case of Castleshane, not very far away from here, that was burned in February 1920. With the landlord presence removed, farmers who had taken the Lucas Scudamore lands and parts of his domain on Conacre became reluctant to pay their rents. By March 1921, the domain was being pillaged. One old friend informed Sybil Lucas Scudamore, who by then had moved to Wales, that people were making, and I quote, a total hand of the woods. Large farmers are taking their firing out of it. 3 out of the one house at a time, carrying trees out the road and wheeling them home in a barrow, and others even pulling up evergreen shrubs by the roots to set. And from the outset, the estate solicitor, T.F. Crozier, had strongly advised Sybil that the entire domain should be sold. As he put it, land is fetching such a high price at the present time, and further pointed out that the possibility of rebuilding any class of house that would be in keeping with the domain is entirely out of the question. No point in you thinking, in other words, of rebuilding Castleshane. Sybil Lucas Scudamore took Crozier's advice and sold off the untended lands in 1922. But she managed to retain the domain for another decade, until in the early 1930s, just before a general election, M.T. Henchy, an Irish Land Commission inspector, was sent to Castleshane to carry out a survey of the lands that were to be compulsorily acquired and redistributed amongst the small farmers in the area, using powers that had been given under the 1923 Land Act. Of course, it was on the eve of a general election, and the government were under pressure to expedite land redistribution because Fianna Fáil were on the rise and were committing to this in their election manifesto. What Henchy found was in stark contrast to a previous time when the estate was efficiently run by a landlord and maintained by an army of labourers. The lands, he wrote, were in very poor condition, being for the most part overgrown with rushes and thistles. It was soon taken over by the Land Commission and planted with fir trees. Now, many of you will be familiar with Patrick Kavanagh's poem Epic, which encapsulates, I think, the very soul of rural Monaghan from the 1920s onwards. I have lived in important places, times when great events were decided. Who owned that half a rood of rock, a no man's land, surrounded by our pitchfork-armed claims? I heard the Duffy shouting, "Damn your sow!" and old McCabe, stripped to the waist, seen step the plot defying blue cast steel. Here is the march along these iron stones. This was the year of the Munich bother. Which was more important? I inclined to lose my faith in Ballyrush and Gorton, till Homer's ghost came whispering through my mind. He said, I made the Iliad from such a local row. Gods make their own importance. The ordinary man and woman in Monaghan cared little about what Hitler was doing in Europe. They were more concerned with local issues, and access to land was central to these. And this is why I would hang a whole exhibition on this, built around the everyday experience of small farm life in post-independence Ireland. The work of the Land Commission, rural tensions, the compulsory acquisition of lands, local political shenanigans in relation to the redistribution schemes, and even the disappearance of the big house. For many more mansions, as I said already, disappeared from the 1920s onwards than had been burned during the revolutionary period. In Monaghan, only a handful of these country houses are left. Where they do exist, in Glasslaw, Hilton Park, they continue to be important to the local economy. Lough Fay and Carrickmacross could be an immense economic value to the area if the big house was to be democratised and the local community embraced and let inside the domain walls instead of being kept out. Some time ago, working with a colleague of mine, we developed a paper around the theme of a bigger sense of place, defining the new local, in which we argued that the gardens and domains of historic houses remain an enormous and untapped resource for public enjoyment, recreation, well-being and education. While heritage tourism has prospered in recent years, it is clear, even pre-pandemic, that numbers visiting houses have either flattened or declined, while visits to gardens and outdoor spaces have increased. Their outdoor attractions, as clearly seen at Rossmore Park, have a great deal to offer families, especially if they have ancillary attractions such as playgrounds, devised trails and so on. And they can also offer entrees to the multiple pleasures of green spaces, and they can engender environmental awareness. They can encourage exercise and promote mental and physical well-being. For many, the appeal of such historic sites is their local identity. And these sites can range from the big house, such as Castle Leslie, to this now very impressive Presbyterian meeting house at Cahan. These sites can draw in audiences from further afield, who are curious and even hungry for knowledge, or who just want to be simply entertained. Now, I saw in the Standard last week the event held here by the Brown family. And I go back to the point that the Cahans exodus presents wonderful opportunity, but I probably don't need to tell you that. To exploit what you already have here, or indeed in Monaghan as a whole, requires a greater and more nuanced understanding of the individual capacities of each site, whether that be a house, garden, domain, or meeting house. And this can be driven in several ways, and it is very much so in Monaghan, in particular through local community involvement, regular tourism, creative arts, and education. A critical component is to identify a broader range of local stakeholders. In other words, one doesn't have to be a Presbyterian in order to share the history and enjoy that of Cahans. At Maynooth University, we have developed a new sort of initiative that a location like this would be ideal for. It is known as Communiversity, meaning where the university comes to meet the local community. It is a partnership that involves Maynooth University and local community-based organisations such as Leader and the Public Library Service. It involves sending university lecturers into local communities to begin a conversation about all aspects of social, economic, cultural and political life. It provides people of all classes, creeds, levels of educational attainment with a unique opportunity to be part of a learning community and in the process build confidence and personal capacity. And research has shown that the Communiversity experience allows people to connect with their neighbours and engage in voluntary activities and community development, which in turn leads to a greater sense of individual well-being. Simply stated, participants meet one morning per week for about 14 weeks in their local library or local community centre for a 2.5-hour workshop. They take subjects such as local history, and that to me is always a very appropriate one to start with, as everybody knows something about their own area and they can talk from experience with confidence, therefore beginning the whole dialogue that is central to the programme. And this can be followed by modules in effectively any subject: economics, politics, sociology, philosophy, criminology, so on. There are no assignments, there are no assessments. Quite simply, the participants engage with the university teachers, they learn, discuss, debate, develop their thinking, impart their own knowledge and experience, and from this teachers learn as much as their students, and ultimately learn to help themselves and their local communities. All the local community has to do is essentially provide the venue. So dare I be so bold, Minister, as to say that such a programme would be ideally suited to any community and rural development scheme. But may I also, at this point, congratulate you on the myriad of community and rural development schemes you have initiated and supported in our county. I mean, nearly every week when I open the Standard, I see a list of the schemes you've supported, and I note how equitably that funding is distributed across the county and across denominational lines. So, I'm drawing to a conclusion. I think the last decade or so, the so-called decade of commemorations, has shown us how far we have come as a maturing and modernising society. We have dealt with the thorny issue of commemoration in a very real way. And here, special mention must be made of Liam Bradley's outstanding work in relation to the Decade of Centenary exhibitions in Monaghan County Museum. I've worked with Liam, and I know how conscientious he is about presenting history in the way it should be: factual, open, transparent, objective, and fair to all sides. And again, Minister Humphreys, and I'm not applying for the role of your electioneering campaign manager here now, but it was you who oversaw the beginning of it all. And indeed, perhaps, the most high-profile and sensitive commemorative event, the 100th anniversary of the Easter Rising. And during one of her many speeches at the time, the Minister described her own ancestral background, her Ulster Unionist and Orange heritage, and told of her grandfather signing the Ulster Solemn League and Covenant in 1912, pledging to fight Home Rule by force if necessary. And she said, "I'm sure that at the time he never in his wildest dreams would have thought that his only granddaughter, a little over 100 years later, would serve as a minister in the Irish government with responsibility for commemorations." I think it was a fair enough conclusion. Mind you, I wonder what my own grandfather would say, him being a small Catholic nationalist farmer from Killarney, if he knew his grandson would be advocating the protection of the big house as part of Ireland's shared heritage and national patrimony. But there you have it. And here is Heather and I sharing the same platform, celebrating the restoration of a Presbyterian meeting house. And next week, Ryan Wiley, a new type of Monaghan hero, will lead this county in the GAA All-Ireland series. His story, and hopefully all our stories, will become part of a new narrative, describing how far we have travelled to now being able to come together and respect our distinctive culture and traditions. Monaghan people have a wonderful awareness of sense of place, that emotive bond and attachment to our heritage and our landscape. Over 100 years ago, Sir John Leslie, one of the largest landlords in County Monaghan of Glasslaw, said, "There is in my head a feeling of attachment to this home of my birth that exceeds all love." A few decades later, Patrick Kavanagh, who came from a completely the opposite side of the social spectrum, the son of a cobbler small farmer, whose poetry reveals so beautifully his raw love for his native area, despite his myriad frustrations, evoked in such simple images as his father playing the melodeon at Christmas, his mother milking the cows, or strolling beneath the poplar trees, or maybe more appropriate to this time of the year, the barrels of blue potato spray that stood on a headland in July, beside an orchard wall where roses were young girls hanging from the sky. So it's now time, I think, for the next generation to create their own sense of place and their own images, inspired by the natural and built heritage of this wonderful county of ours, to learn from history, but not to be chained by it, and to use what they learn to create a much better present in order to shape the future. And from what I've heard today in relation to the ambitions for this meeting house, I think it'll become a very important place in that respect. Thank you.
And thank you, Terence. We're coming close to, but perhaps one of the most important parts of the afternoon programme in the RT, which Caroline and her team will provide shortly. But before that, we're going to have a little musical interlude. I'll introduce that in a moment. But over the years, we've had a number of partners who have supported and worked with the Cahans Meeting House Committee, such as the Clogher Historical Society, and who's representing Clogher Historical Society today. And there are others of us who are members there, and also the Presbyterian Historical Society. Jim Stothers and Linda are here today representing the Presbyterian Historical Society. We recognise we cannot do these things on our own. We need all sorts of partners with support and encouragement. And once again, we acknowledge it. Thanks for that.